Ja, da begynner vi. My name is Greta Antona Nilsen, and I'm chair of pt.1 Norway. And I'm lucky to welcome you all to this third seminar at Litteraturhuset in Oslo. pt.1 Norway are a non-partisan organization working to inform Norwegians about basic income and work to get basic income implemented in Norway. I'm not going to speak long tonight, but today this seminar is called Basic Income, Quality of Life and Health. And today we have Andrew Kroglund as the chair, so I just give him the word. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be asked to chair this little evening session. My background is from various Norwegian NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and as a freelance writer having opinions about this and that. I'm particularly delighted to be here tonight because, as you all know, we live in changing times in the sense that there are scientists out there saying that we are actually witnessing a shift of geological dimensions. We are moving from one era called the Holocene to a new era called the Anthropocene. Anthropocene, of course, means the man-made era, which means that our footprint as a species is so great that the composition, if you like, the biophysical composition of our planet is changing. So in that sense, discussing important issues as to environment, development, and how we organize our own societies is very, very important. And of course, the idea of basic income is one part of a larger puzzle. And we are delighted tonight to have with us, all the way from Canada, Evelyn Forget. She is a professor at the Institute for, what was it again? Could you?
Health policy.
Pardon?
Health policy.
Health policy at the Manitoba University in Canada. And what is particularly interesting about Evelyn is that she has done research on a community which actually have lived through the experience of trying basic income for some years. That means that scholars have the possibility of reaching back in time in evaluating how such a scheme fared in the real world. So it's more than just a good idea, it is an idea which can be scrutinized. So the idea tonight is that Evelyn gives us a short introduction, no more than 30 minutes, sort of a lecture. Then afterwards, we will have a Norwegian perspective, who will comment on what this might mean in a Norwegian context. And she will be speaking in Norwegian, giving a 10 minutes impression, and then we have a informed debate where you are also able to participate. And all in all, we'll be together here for approximately 1 hour. And our idea is that when we leave this room, we are a little more informed about the issues at hand than when we came. So Evelyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. What I'd like to do is to take you back a little bit in time to 1974. 1974, the governments of Canada, that is the federal government, and the province of Manitoba decided to rethink the way we delivered social programs. And as part of that, they implemented a very large field experiment in what at the time was called a guaranteed annual income. This was one of 5 similar experiments that were held in North America around about the same time. 4 were in the US, and 1 was in Canada. This was a time when we were rethinking the way we delivered all kinds of social programs. It's a very different world on the other side of the Atlantic in terms of social welfare. There was very little support for anybody. This was the first time that we introduced a generous pension for seniors. There was a very small one before that. This was a time when we first began to make more generous disability pensions and unemployment insurance. And it was the very same time that we introduced universal health insurance. Before 1971, there was no universal health insurance in Canada. And I should say before I begin that there are different kinds of a basic income. The one I'm talking about was means tested. It depended on the incomes of families. So the only families that received support were low-income families. As income increased, the payout declined. It was set up in a way we would now call a refundable tax credit. It was called a negative income tax at the time. So if a family had no income from any other source at all, they'd receive about 60% of a relative poverty line that was developed. As their income increased, their benefit would be reduced by, so if their income, if they earned, for example, $100 on the labor market, their benefits would be reduced by $50. And what that means is that very low-income families, significantly above the poverty line, would still receive part of the benefit. And what that meant in practice was that people who had previously been receiving social assistance would see very little more money. What they found was that they were part of a system with a whole lot fewer rules, so they had a great deal more liberty. The social welfare scheme has a number of limitations and restrictions on it. So a person collecting social assistance at the time would have to follow 200 or 250 different rules in order to collect. Otherwise, they could be disqualified. This guaranteed income scheme, called MINCOM, eliminated all of those rules. The people who really benefited in terms of money were the working poor. People who were in the labor market received no benefit at all at the time. So this was a significant increase in their income. So how was the experiment set up? It was conducted in the province of Manitoba in Canada, and I'll show you a map in a minute. But there were two sites. The first was an urban center, Winnipeg, and in Winnipeg there were at the time about 500,000 people, and it was set up as a classic experiment. So researchers went into town, selected a group of people, randomized people into the test and into control groups, and looked at the results of the experiment. But the program I'm going to talk to you about occurred in the little town of Dauphin, Manitoba. There were about 10,000 people living in the town of Dauphin. And it was interesting because it was a saturation site. And a saturation site means that everybody in town was eligible to participate in the experiment. And about a third of the families in town had incomes low enough that they would receive supplementation. So about 3,000 people in Dauphin, 3,500 people, in fact, received income support under the scheme. And so what I wanted to do was to find out what the effects of this program were. Now, the reason these experiments were run in the first place was because there's a very deep-seated fear in North America that if you give people money, they'll stop working. And they really believed that if you supplemented people's incomes, there would be this massive flight from the labor market. And so they actually set up many of these experiments in order to prove that that would happen and that therefore we ought not to introduce it. Researchers who examined subsequently the Winnipeg sample found that people who received supplementation did in fact work fewer hours. The number of hours worked fell by about 13.5%, which a lot of people thought was a lot. But it turns out if you look at it more carefully, there were some really interesting results. Grown-up people who had real jobs did not reduce the number of hours they worked. Nobody quit their job in order to live on 2/3 of the poverty line. The people who reduced the number of hours they worked fell into two groups. Remember, this is 1974 in Canada. One of the groups were married women, and they effectively used the guaranteed income to buy themselves longer maternity leaves. Official maternity leave at the time was 4 weeks. There was no parental leave, right? So people who left the labor market in order to give birth decided to use the guaranteed income to stay home for slightly more than a month. The other group of people who reduced the number of hours they worked, and here the language is really important. If you're not a supporter of basic income, what you say is that unattached young males reduce the number of hours they work by up to 80%. If you are a supporter of guaranteed income, you say that adolescent children decided to stay in school a little bit longer and took their first full-time job at a slightly older age. So instead of dropping out of high school at the age of 16, when they were legally able to do, they decided to stay there just a little bit longer. I was interested not so much in labor market effects, because it never occurred to me that there would be a big impact, but I wondered what impact it might have on people's quality of life, what impact it would have on their health, for example. And when the project was set up originally, there was an intention of finding that out, doing the analysis, but research funding for the analysis ran out midway through the experiment. And if you've ever been involved in government-funded social science research, you know why that happened, right? Governments changed, both at the provincial level and at the federal level. Conservative right-wing governments were elected, and they were much less interested in this whole project of income. So the money was cut. The project was being run by economists, and the economists decided that they weren't very interested in sociology experiments. So when they had to cut back on the experiments, they cut back on all the interesting parts. They focused on the labor market, and they stopped conducting research on health and quality of life. And what that meant was that this experiment was run for 5 years. Data was collected, a lot of data was collected, but no database was ever constructed for social issues, and there was no significant analysis of social issues. So a few years ago, I went looking for the data, and it took me a long time to track it down. The data had been packed off and disappeared. I finally found it, and I found it in hard copy. I found 1,800 boxes of it, and the files, as you can imagine, were a mess. So there were questionnaires, there were reports of anthropologists and sociologists who had been embedded in the families, who actually lived with the families and wrote reports on what happened. There were all kinds of interviews, but they were not organized in any way. And I ran into a second problem, and that is that the ethics board at my university was worried about privacy of individuals. So I knew who got the money, but I wasn't allowed to contact them. So I was kind of in a hard place, and I was wondering if there was another way to get at what actually happened in Dauphin. Now, this is just a reminder. So the project it actually ran from 1974 to 1979, but the money was distributed between 1974 and 1978. And when I first tried to get at the data, I started calling the Provincial Department of Education, and I got enrollment figures for all the high schools in the province, and I divided them into 3 groups. The light blue line there represents Dauphin. The dark purple line represents Winnipeg, which is the urban center, and the other line, the sort of cream-colored line, is the rest of the province. And I made up this statistic, and that's grade 12 enrollment. Grade 12 is the last year of high school in Canada. Grade 12 enrollment as a percent of the previous year's grade 11 enrollment. Now that's important because all of the children in grade 12 were old enough that they could quit high school, and many of them did, particularly those in poor families. If everybody who was in grade 11 continued to grade 12, each one of those bars would be at 100%. The bigger your dropout rate between grade 11 and grade 12, the lower the bar is. So if you look at the first 4 years there, up to 1974, what you see is pretty much what you'd expect to see. Kids in urban centers were much more likely to finish high school than kids in rural areas. Not much difference between Dauphin and the rest of Manitoba. But look what happened starting in 1975. So families get money in 1974, By 1975, Dauphin kids are continuing to grade 12 at a higher rate than kids even in Winnipeg. By 1976, the Dauphin bar goes above 100%. So kids who'd previously dropped out of school were attracted back to school to finish high school. 1977, the money's still flowing, the bar's at 100%. 1978, the money's still flowing, the Dauphin bar is at almost 100%. Money stops, 1979, we're right back where we started from, with not much difference between Dauphin and the rest of Manitoba. That last bar you can ignore because there are difficulties with the data there. So it looks like we've got a little bit of a coincidence there, right? A nice little bubble that's exactly coincident with the payout of the money. So kids are staying in school a little bit longer. So we found all those unattached young males who were quitting their jobs. Turns out they're in math class. They're staying in high school for another year. And so I looked for another data set, and this won't surprise anybody here at the kind of data we have, but it's very unusual in North America. Because we had universal health insurance and no private system in the 1970s, means every contact with the healthcare system goes through my database. So anybody who lived in Manitoba for any time between 1971 and the present shows up in my population registry, identified by a personal number and a family number. And I can link those over time, and I can link them to all kinds of contacts with social services. In the 1970s, that database was not as well developed as it is now, but the hospitalization and the physician databases were very good. So I can look at how many times people were admitted to the hospital, what happened to them there, when they went to see their doctor, and so on. And just in terms of the design of the experiment, I mean, a lot of things happened since 1974, and I want to talk about causation. So I want to make sure that anything I find is actually attributable to income and not something else. And to do that, I had to find a group of people who were just like my Dauphin subjects, except they didn't get the guaranteed income. And in order to do that, I had to find a control group. So the first thing I did, let me give you a map here. Manitoba is right in the middle of Canada. It's a small province. There are about 1.2 million people in the whole province, and about 2/3 of them live in the one city, Winnipeg, the urban center. Dauphin is over there. It's a town of about 10,000, and it's sort of an agricultural center. And what I wanted to do was find people just like my Dauphin subjects who didn't receive income during the period. So I went into my database and I took out all the people who lived in Winnipeg, because city people are different from small town people in terms of how they access hospitals and doctors. I took out people in the north because the north has a lot of mining, a lot of it's socially different. And I took out people living on First Nations reserves, Indian reservations, because in Canada, if you're a First Nations person, if you're a treaty Indian, the federal government's responsible for your health care, so you don't show up on my database. And what I had left in the database were a whole lot of people living in towns pretty much like Dauphin, a lot of little towns all over the province. And then I tried to match on other characteristics. So for every individual in Dauphin, I found 3 other individuals of the same age and sex who lived in the same kind of family and the same kind of a town. And then I could compare their use of hospitals and doctors with the people who lived in Dauphin. I also went back to the census to find out if there was any difference between my subjects and my controls, and I found 2 differences, and I'm just going to mention this because it tells you a little bit about Canada, I think. The first is the percentage of farmland planted in canola. So they were no more likely to be farmers in Dauphin than they were in the other towns, but if they lived in Dauphin, they were more likely to be growing rapeseed or canola. That doesn't matter. The second one might. On the census at the time, Canadians were asked, what is your ethnic background? Where do your people come from? And remember, Canada's a nation of immigrants, and we've been a nation of immigrants for a very long time. So somebody like me, for example, whose family has been in Canada since the mid-1700s would answer France. People in Dauphin answered the Ukraine. It turns out that people in Dauphin were much more likely to say that their background is the Ukraine than people in my control sample, about 1/3 of them. But the people in Dauphin had been in Manitoba for probably 2 or 3 generations by the 1970s. Most of them came between 1910 and 1920. So I have this up there because it's a difference, but these people have been in Canada long enough that one can say that they're Canadians. They're eating the same food that everybody else eats, and they're living very much as Canadians are. They don't speak Ukrainian. So anyway, what did I find out? My first question was, were they any healthier? And the blue line represents Dauphin, the red line represents my control group. Turns out before the experiment, Dauphinites were less healthy than the control group. They were about 8.5% more likely to be hospitalized. When the money starts flowing in 1974, those two lines come together. By the end of the experiment, there's virtually no difference between Dauphin and the control group. And I followed these people to 1985, and the gap didn't reappear. So what does that mean? It means if we gave people money, they were less likely to go into the hospital. Why should that be? Well, we know that poor health is associated with poverty. The decline is pretty significant. As I said, it's an 8.5% decline relative to the control group. And when I drilled down more closely to find out what was causing it, there were two basic causes for the reduction in hospitalizations. The first one was hospitalizations for accidents and injuries. And that's a big category that takes in almost all acute care. So that's picking up people who are in industrial accidents or farm accidents, vehicle accidents, very often associated with drunk driving, family violence, all kinds of things. Not surprisingly, the gap between Dauphin and the control group is very large at the beginning. The two lines start to come together. By 1978, there's no difference between the two. So there's a general increase over that whole period in hospitalizations for accidents and injuries, but the two lines come together, and that's significant. The second one, and much more important, is people who were hospitalized for mental health diagnoses. Dauphin starts out significantly higher than the comparison group, the control group. 1974, the two lines start to come together. By the end of the period, there's virtually no difference. I looked at their contacts with family doctors. I found exactly the same pattern. The only thing that turned out to be significant were visits to family doctors with mental health complaints. So stress, right? There was a significant reduction in the number of visits by Dauphinites relative to the controls. So people seem to be healthier, at least they were using the healthcare system less. We also wondered if there were any other effects, and these are in here. These are in here because they turned out to be of significant political interest in the US. Remember I told you there were 5 experiments, 4 of them in the US. And the US ones were very, very contentious. Now the first one is in there because most researchers who look at poverty always wonder whether it's going to have an effect on birth outcomes. That is, our baby's going to be bigger and healthier when they're born. And usually they expect them to be. Secondly, we looked at birth rates because a lot of those same people who worried that all the men are going to quit their jobs, worried that all the women are going to stay home and have babies in order to increase their benefits. And there was a fear that that might happen, so we looked at birth rates to find out if in fact that happened. And the third one might look a little odd, and that's divorce rates. And that sounds a little bit odd, but it turned out that that was probably the reason that the 4 experiments in the US ended. Some of the researchers thought they saw an increase in divorce rates. And I think we can all imagine situations where marriages continue that ought not to continue. But the way it was portrayed in the US Senate was something along the lines of, if you give these women money, some of them are going to decide they can do without their husbands. And that is an attack on the American family, and we're not having it. So we looked to find out if there was a massive increase in the divorce rate in Dauphin during the period. This is my granddaughter. Why might birth outcomes be affected by poverty? People who look at birth outcomes in poverty usually identify 2 reasons. They think that there's an increase in low birth weight babies, and that's really significant because low birth weight babies often have a number of physical and sometimes other problems that persist throughout childhood and even into adulthood. So you really want to reduce the number of very low birth weight babies who are born. They think that there might be 2 reasons for that. The first is that the poor are much less likely to have prenatal care. And the second is nutrition during pregnancy. If your diet is bad during pregnancy, you might be more likely to give birth to a low birth weight baby. So I looked at everything. We looked at low birth weight. We looked at something called at-risk birth weight, which includes very low and very high weight babies who are also not very healthy. We looked at babies who are defined as small for gestational age. We looked at perinatal deaths, of which there were virtually none, and we found absolutely nothing. And we wondered why we didn't get an effect on birth outcomes. We were very disappointed not to find the effect. And I think the reason is actually that we're dealing with relatively small numbers. When you say 10,000, 10,000 more or less in your subjects and 3 times that in your controls, you've got 40,000 people. But that doesn't actually generate a whole lot of babies, not over the course of 4 years. So we've got a small number of babies, and most babies are healthy no matter what circumstances they're born in. So, bad birth outcomes are relatively rare. I think the second reason is that we had universal health insurance. So in principle, everybody should have had access to the same prenatal care. And I think the third reason for the outcomes is that this is a small town, and during the period, poverty didn't show up as food insecurity. So people were relatively well fed. There was a lot of home production of food, and there was a lot of sharing as well. Birth and divorce rates. This is a picture of the Ukrainian Catholic Church in Dauphin, and that's there just as a reminder that lots of things affect birth and divorce rates, not just the amount of money you have. Birth rates absolutely did not increase. Fertility was falling dramatically right across North America, right around the world in the 1970s, especially in rural areas. This was a period in Canada when the birth control pill had just become legal and available. And families were going from 8 and 10 children to 2 and 3 children, and they certainly weren't increasing. And when I looked at it in a whole variety of ways, it turned out that families were falling in size further and faster among the people who got a guaranteed income relative to the controls. And you'll be happy to know that while a minimum income might be an attack on the American family, the Canadian family survived intact. So we didn't find a huge increase in the divorce rate. I think overall, children were probably the most affected by this experiment, particularly children whose families received a guaranteed income during vulnerable periods in their lives. So they were more likely to finish high school. They were more likely to have their first child at a later age. So the girls were not dropping out of school at 16 and having 3 babies by the age of 21, as they had been before, very early marriages. And they had fewer children over a lifetime. And all of those things are associated with better health and social outcomes. I'm just going to end by talking a little bit about how the families who received income thought it affected their lives. This person is a very colorful lady who lives in Dauphin. She's now 83. That's a picture of her and her family during the 1970s. And Amy Richardson was a woman with a disabled husband and 6 children. Her husband actually died during the experiment, and so she became a young widow with 6 children. And she worked. She ran a little business from her house, the Dauphin Beauty Parlor. You can imagine you don't make a lot of money cutting other people's hair in your house in a rural area during this period. Her husband died at 53 because of his health problems, and she said she used the extra money for the luxuries of life, things like school books. Canada, you paid for school books in high school, right? It was to bring your income up to where it should be. It was enough to add some cream to the coffee. Everybody was the same, so there was no shame. And that last sentence is really important, and that shows up again and again and again in what people are saying. This isn't welfare, right? This is what you deserve. This is what's important. Hugh and Doreen Henderson are very typical of the families that we dealt with. She was a stay-at-home mom with 2 kids who had a very large garden, kept chickens in her backyards, and did a lot of canning and baking. Her husband was a school janitor, which was a seasonal job and a low-income job during the period. Hugh says, if a kid wants an education and he's willing to pay for it, I think the government should help. If we'd have had more money, I would have loved to pay for university for my kids. Doreen says, give them enough money to raise their kids. People work hard and it's still not enough. This isn't welfare. This is making sure kids have enough to eat. They should have kept it. It made a real difference. And I'm going to end with this guy because I think he's my favorite. He's my favorite because this is a guy who you would expect to oppose something like Mincome. He was a chartered accountant. Remember, Mincome is means tested, so his income was too high. I mean, barring barring really unforeseen circumstances, he'd probably never collect any support from a scheme like Mincome. So it's his tax money that goes to pay for the program. And what does he say? He said, we always felt the problem with the welfare system is it was punitive. If you made money, they took it away from you. It seemed to us that Mincome was for people who were on that line. They weren't deadbeats, they just needed a bit of a boost. I'd be in favor of it now. Helping someone have a decent living wage is hard to argue with. And I think I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. Our next speaker, Evelyn, she has been labeled the Twitter Queen of Norway. She's written 4 books as far as I'm informed. 7 books. She's in different media. As a commentator, she's had her own television program, and she's of course a lecturer at the Oslo Business School. She has been asked to give her perspective on the basic income idea in a Norwegian context. And you'll speak in Norwegian.
Thank you. I'm so sorry I have to speak in Norwegian, but my English is good for just these 2 sentences. Da det slutt. Da må det bli norsk. Men I will ask...
Skal jeg kjøre den, eller vil du kjøre den selv?
Nei, du har fått den på, ja?
Ja da, så nå er det bare til å...
Herlig. Vet du hva? Da skal jeg prøve å koordinere armer og bein her. Andrew, jeg tenkte, når jeg sier noe viktig, så tenkte jeg, da kan du oversette, så da kan jeg gi deg et hint når jeg føler at jeg har sagt noe viktig. Noe av det som, det gjør jo inntrykk å høre den historien her, av 2 grunner. Det ene er fordi det er faktisk noen som har prøvd det. Det har vært gjort. Det andre er jo fordi vi opplever hvor ulikt dette samfunnet er. Det er så ulikt fordi vi er så veldig, veldig mye rikere. Jeg tenkte å starte med å fortelle når jeg for 2. gang ble opptatt av dette med borgerlønn. Første gang var da jeg leste Vennerøds bok. Christian Vennerøds bok, Arbeid mindre, lev mer. Er det noen andre som har lest den? Ja, det er noen på min alder, hallo. Ja. Men så glemte jeg jo det for en stund, og så fikk jeg barn. Han til venstre er min. Og nå skal jeg fortelle dere hvordan det var å sitte på benken utenfor blokka i 19... Når kan dette ha vært da? 1970... Nei, 79 kanskje? 91, 92. Vi satt 4 kvinner på den benken. Det var Randi. Nei, jeg kan begynne med Eva. Hun var hjemmeværende. Hun var forsørget av mannen sin. Det betyr at hele hennes tilværelse var finansiert av hennes mann. De betalte, kan du si, hennes borgerlønn selv. Hun var en fantastisk ressursperson i det nærmiljøet. Så var det jeg som hadde en typisk karrierejobb, men den hadde ikke jeg helt helse til, så med jevne mellomrom så var jeg sykmeldt et par måneder. Da fikk jeg 100% lønn, så min karriere er finansiert av skattebetalerne i de periodene. Og det er noe jeg kommer tilbake til, det at vi har 100% lønn under sykdom, for jeg synes det er galt. Alle synes det er riktig, jeg synes det er galt, jeg skal forklare hvorfor. Så var det Randi som var uføretrygdet. Randi var en fantastisk ressursperson i nærmiljøet, og ved siden av å være ufør, så jobbet hun svart som dagmamma. Og når jeg forteller alle det, for dette har jeg snakket om noen ganger, så tenker folk, å Gud, så grusomt for en trygdemisbruker. Vet du hva? Det falt meg ikke inn. Men det var en av disse som plagde meg litt, og det var den 4. Det var Tove. Hun jobbet nemlig full jobb som og hun var ikke syk en dag, for hun hadde en grusom arbeidsmoral. Og hvis du ser på oss fire, jeg som tjente godt, og som fikk da finansiert mine nervesammenbrudd av skattebetalerne, fulle, Eva, hvor familie tok hele kostnaden, Tove, som jobbet og sleit uten å få en krone av noen, og Randre, som da ble finansiert av skattebetalerne på et lavere nivå. Vi kom vidt forskjellig ut av statens inntektslotteri. Det forskjellen på Norge på 90-tallet og Canada på 70-tallet. Vi bader i penger, men vi fordeler dem på en veldig rar måte. Vi kunne hatt en femteperson på benken. Vi kunne hatt en som gikk på sosialpenger, og som hver eneste måned måtte ydmyke seg og bringe sine lommer og sin sjel for å få utbetalt bitte lite grann, og som levde konstant utrygghet. Det fordelingen vi har valgt i det norske velferdssamfunnet. Du kan vinne i lotto på et eller annet nivå. Du kan ta ansvar for ditt eget liv, eller du kan på en måte kastes på ulvene. Dette ganske tilfeldig. Og det tilfeldigheten i vårt velstandssamfunn som gjør at jeg får borgerlønn. Og det må du si, at det tilfeldigheten. For det synes jeg et viktig forhold. Dette arbeidslinja, folkens. Jeg googlet arbeidslinja. Og så tenkte jeg, nå tar jeg det første bildet jeg finner. Images, Google images. Arbeidslinja is a kind of holy grail in Norwegian. Everybody shall work all the time. That was a picture. It's a kind of katalog. Hva heter det, sånn byråbilde? Ja, alle lykkelige, alle jobber, alle har hver sin arbeidsuniform, alle vakre og alle spreke, og sånn skal vi alle være. Og dette jo bare tull. Altså, de folkene der kan være så innmari glad at det går noen uføretrygde folk rundt i lokalmiljøet og plaster knærne på barna deres når barna faller, og kort sagt holder lokalmiljøet gående. Dette mitt andre poeng. Og det at de som ikke jobber, hvorav noen får en god økonomi, fordi de har vunnet i lotteriet, andre har en elendig økonomi. De som går hjemme, de holder lokalsamfunnet sammen. Jeg ser jo oftest, eller jeg prøver å se sånn ut som det der. Og det gjorde jeg også når jeg jobbet. Og Gud hjelpe meg, så takknemlig jeg overfor de som var hjemme og ga en trygghet for barna mine som brukere. Noe av det jeg synes mest urettferdig med det norske type velferdssystemet, det jo at de ber om diagnoser. Altså, i Norway, very rich country, if you have a diagnosis, you will get money, at least if you have been in work for some years. Then you are lucky. So everybody wants a diagnosis, and I think that's... Altså, det synes jeg bare helt håpløst. Vi gjør folk syke, fordi de må bare finne diagnosen, sånn at de kan overleve økonomisk. Hvis jeg hadde valget mellom å gå på sosialkontoret, måtte ydmyke meg, leve i usikkerhet og få lite penger, eller å ende med en uføretrygd på et ganske høyt nivå, så hvor jeg var trygg for inntekten resten av livet, det klart jeg ville kjenne veldig godt etter. Dette skadelig, dette sykdomsfremkommende, og det også en grunn til at jeg får borgerlønn. Altså, vi verdens sykeste folk, i mål til diagnoser. Det, og en helt åpenbar grunn til det, det jo at diagnoser inngangsbilletten for økonomiske ytelser. Det burde det ikke vært. Vi straffer folk som ikke dytter sine egne sykdommer, som går på jobben, eller Eller kanskje bare, ja. Nei, vet du hva, nå mister jeg litt tempo her. Har holdt på i nesten 10 minutter. Skal jeg holde kjeft?
Nei,
ok. Så, have you heard about the executive monkey? It's a kind of social experiment, no, not social, dyrisk eksperiment. Det et av de mest berømte sosialpsykologiske forsøkene. Og det var at man tok aper i bur, og så ga man en støt. Dette var på 60-tallet, da det var lov med sånn dyreforsøk. Og så man hvem som fikk blødende mavesår først. Var det de apene som bare fikk støtene, eller var det de som også hadde fått en pedal, sånn at de kunne ha litt kontroll selv? Totalt sett fikk begge typene like mye strøm i seg, men det ene følte altså at de hadde en viss kontroll over situasjonen. Det viste seg, forsøket ble gjort i mange omganger. I første omgang så det ut som det var de som ikke kunne kontrollere noe som helst, som var friskest, og de som hadde pedal, det syke. Da viste det at man hadde gjort feil utvalg. Konklusjonen aper som har en spak å dra i, så de kan redusere, selv om strømstyrken totalt sett den samme, men sånn at de føler at de har kontroll, de holder seg friske. Dette akkurat som fallskjermsoldater. Hvis du trener dem godt, så kan du utsette dem for det grusomste ting. De holder seg friske. I hvert fall hvis de samtrent. Dette vet de i Forsvaret. Så, og der også noe av poenget med Borgerlønn. Hvis du gir folk kontroll over deres egen økonomi, forutsiglighet over egen økonomi, så fikser de det meste. Det jo helt utrolig. Man skulle tro at, altså av og til når jeg hører på politikerne, så snakker de jo som om vi alle må ha hjelp. Men vi må ikke det. Hvis folk bare overlever økonomisk, så fikser det livet sitt veldig bra. Jeg jobbet med forhandle oppsigelsene til folk på begynnelsen av 90-tallet, og da basset vi oppsigelser. Da var det kjempehøy arbeidsledighet. Og jeg sa til alle de som mistet jobben, glem det der med jobb og identitet og sånn. Altså, vet du hva? Det bare noe de innbiller deg. Ha et steinhardt blikk på lommeboka di. Fikser vi økonomien, så fikser du livet ditt etterpå. Og det gjorde de. Men jeg hører Robert Eriksson og alle arbeidsministre før han legger ansiktet i alvorlige folder og sier at arbeid jo livsinnhold og bla bla bla. Det ikke det, for folk driver på. Uansett om de har lønnsarbeid eller ikke. De aktive, de finner på ting, de gjør ting. Jeg tror dette med Borgerlønn kommer til å tvinge seg fram, og jeg tror det holdt på å skje nå. Her da min elegante foil. This is my foil. Heter det foil? Foil making, ja. Her, se her. Dette har jeg fra en amerikansk forskning i mitt fag, som samfunnsgeografi, economic geography. Her har du mengden folk, ikke sant? Sånn. Og så her har du hva slags jobb de har. Jo mer lønn og moro, og lønn og moro følger hverandre ofte av, altså. Jo mer lønn og moro, jo mer oppover ikke sant? Så her har du de som vasker, står i skrubben på restaurant. Her har du konsertsjefen i Hydro, ikke sant? For å stilisere litt, i det gamle industrisamfunnet så var det sånn majoriteten av oss hadde en trygg jobb. Og det var få i filleproletariatet, og det var få på toppen. Vi i ferd med å gå inn i et samfunn hvor det blir veldig få i det som Guy Standing, som noen av dere kjenner, kaller salariatet. De i trygg og fast jobb, de blir færre. Men det blir flere sånne som meg, for eksempel, som løper rundt og holder foredrag og tjener penger på egentlig mye rart. Det det han kaller the professions, det? Ja. Her har du de selvstendige næringsdrivende, advokat, blir det flere av de som ikke har fast jobb. Som må gå fra engasjement til engasjement. Som virkelig strever med å få hverdagen til å gå i hop, og som hverken har tid eller penger. For de bruker tiden sin til å få neste korte oppdrag. Dette bildet gjør at borgerlønn vil tvinge seg fram, for disse her vil ikke finne seg i det. De kommer rett og slett ikke til å finne seg i det. Dessuten vet jo sånne som meg, som er her, at det skal ikke mer til enn at vi gjør noen dumme ting, prøver oss som næringsdrivende og får kreft samtidig, eller et eller annet sånt, så plutselig, bang, så er vi over her. Som Guy Standing sier, alle kan havne i prekariatet. Absolutt alle. Og det er for meg et viktig poeng, for på ett punkt har høyresiden feil. Og når jeg sier ett punkt, så er det fordi dere må ikke tro at jeg er blitt noe sånn venstre frelst dame, for det er jeg ikke. Jeg stemmer på partier som bare ville få dere til å kaste opp, mange av dere. Men jeg mener at dette systemet holder ikke. Ikke sant? Det går ikke. Dette kan ikke fortsette, og borgerlønn er et opplagt svar. Og når det gjelder Norge, så har vi jo faktisk penger til det. Fordi altså 9 av 10 på sosiale stønader har stønader på et relativt greit nivå. Den 10. er fryktelig usikker. I tillegg har vi da hele den øvre middelklasse i fast jobb som får 100% lønn hver gang de blir syke. Det er helt unødvendig. Vi kan gå ned til 80. Det går helt fint. Så vi har faktisk pengene. The difference between us and Canada in the 70s, we have the money. And I'm not talking about the pension fund, I'm talking about the national budget as it goes. Hvis det var noenlunde... Ja, da ser jeg på Android. Da skal jeg komme til siste formen. Jeg var på en konferanse hvor det var liksom kremen av alle samfunnsøkonomiske forskere fra hele Norden, mest fra Norge, for det var FAFO-initiert. Som snakket om et nordisk prosjekt om hvor går den nordiske modellen. Og da var det en finsk forsker som sa the basic question we, who is in, who is out, the world where the full citizenship is based on nationality or on wage work. Det er hovedspørsmålet. Og arbeidslinja handler jo om at alt skal være på wage work. Og det går jo ikke det. Innvandring er et helt annet kapittel, som jeg kunne holdt et annet foredrag om, men det på en måte fucker opp mye av bildet her, som barna ville sagt. Men det må la seg løse det også, og Guy Standing er jo en av de som snakker om dette på et globalt nivå. Jeg holder meg til Norge, for jeg skjønner meg ikke så mye på verden. Men jeg vil slutte med å anbefale den boka der, som nettopp har kommet på norsk, som handler om prekariatet, og som ender med et kapittel som er et godt begrunnet forslag om borgerlønn. Og det interessante, borgerlønn har jo ingen nordmenn snakket om på 30 år. Noen få sånne idealister og slitere som dere, som liksom prøver å holde levende. Men på Nordmot-konferansen så var det faktisk en av forskerne som sa at dette er kanskje svaret. Det er nytt. Da sier jeg tusen takk for meg.
Okay, tusen takk, Elis. Kan du bare have a seat? So, let's try to have a small exchange of ideas and then we'll open for questions. I'll just ask you first, Evelyn. Given your very interesting research, it seems a very good idea to continue in the Canadian setting. So, when you present this to your Canadian colleagues and to the Canadian public, what type of response do you get? Don't people say that, okay, this has functioned, why don't we go for it?
You know, is this...
You can borrow mine.
Anyway, I'll speak up. That's fine. Thank you. Usually, this is very far from the political mainstream in Canada, as you might imagine. It's true. I mean, we sort of dream of the Nordic countries, particularly the Nordic countries in the 1970s.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I know things are changing in all kinds of ways. But this is very far from the political mainstream, although it's becoming something that people talk about. When I present, the initial reaction is, this is crazy, how could we possibly afford it? By the time I get to the end of it, people are saying, well, wait a minute, look at how much money we're spending on healthcare in Canada. If you can save 8.5% of what we're spending on the health budget, how many families could you support? And wait a minute, you only talked about health. You didn't talk about special education. You didn't talk about youth justice. You didn't talk about all of these other social programs that we know are being driven up by the poverty rate. My university, where I work, my department is in an inner city hospital, and you don't have to walk through those hallways very often to realize that in the hospitals you're treating the consequences of poverty at least as often as you're treating the consequences of accidents or bad luck. You know, we pay for poverty one way or another, and I think that after I speak to people, after people hear about the idea of basic income, they start to recognize how much the status quo is costing us. And so there is growing support, I think, in Canada. There's interestingly a gender and generational divide. When I speak, older women are universally in favor of this, usually women who've had some experience raising families with less generous benefits. And young men are the least likely to support it because they imagine that everybody else either should go out and work for a living and won't unless they're driven by fear.
Well, that's interesting because I recognize the same pattern. I worked in a financial newspaper, internet newspaper called E24, and if I was mentioning basic income, I mean, the young men on 25, they laughed so they fell off the chair, and they said, Elin, do you think anybody would work if we get money? And I said, actually, yes. I think so. So, but it's funny. It's a kind of gender and age thing. Mm.
And Elin, do you think it would be a good idea to propose here in Norway to have a community as a case study for a couple of years? Let's say a community of 10,000, just like in Canada, and then you at the business school, for instance, could make this as a case study, study it and see what type of data you got from it.
I think it's much more difficult to have this kind of single community today because of communication, transport. It's a different kind of society. I think so the idea of a little village as an experiment in Norway, I think it's difficult. But I rather would see the whole country as a little experiment. I mean, we're only 5 million, and my basic point is that we use money today, and that's a big difference between we and Canada. We have actually very few people who doesn't have any kind of support, and we have a lot of people who have quite big supports. So the idea to just make it flat, basic income with none of this moralistic, bureaucratic haunting of people, I think that would be a nice experience.
Evelyn, what do you think? I mean, making such a transformation isn't realistic in one go. So what do you think? Would it be an idea for people in the Norwegian public to propose something similar to what you did in Canada? Or has that time gone?
Well, there are different ways of having experiments. I mean, in the Winnipeg sample, for example, it was just a small portion of the population who received a guaranteed income. The recipients didn't know each other, they were isolated from each other, and the controls came from the same community. So, I mean, if you wanted to, you could do it. On the other hand, I mean, I think there is a lot of evidence out there from these and other kinds of experiments. I mean, we pretty much know that people aren't going to quit their jobs in droves, and we pretty much know that we're already paying a lot of money to deal with poverty one way or another. I mean, Norway spends a tremendous amount of money on social benefits. Taking that money and taking the same amount of money and distributing it in different ways would go a very long way towards achieving these ends.
Do you know of any other experiments of the same kind in an industrial country like in Canada?
No. Well, there were 5. Those 5 are the only ones, and I've looked. There have been no other high-income countries have tried this. There are small-scale experiments in low-income and medium-income, moderate-income countries, where villages, for example, receive guaranteed income. But there's no high-income example except for these 5 experiments. Although there are proposals out there, people are proposing all kinds of things.
All right. I saw a woman with her hand up. Could you please stand up and present yourself and the question or comment?
Du glemte om sykelønn 100% og imot hvorfor. I ask why I need not for 100% income under illness. Yeah.
Sickness leave.
Yes.
I'm not so very good in English like Ellen, my neighbor. Okay, but other question. I think to get guaranteed income, you have to in Norway you have to get one diagnosis. And this will be catastrophe for it is tragic.
Tragedy.
Yeah, for one person, because it's not very much serious, but it's how I can see they are ødeleggende for et menneske, for stempel. This person gets one stempel, or this will be young people in Norway getting diagnosed. Oh, this is not serious, but you have to get diagnosed to get a guarantee income. This is catastrophe.
Okay, all right. Okay. Any comments on this?
Yeah, I totally agree on the diagnosis, the consequences of diagnosis giving you money. It's really bad, especially for young people. You ask me why I want sickness leave to have a lower payment rent.
A lower rate.
A lower rate, yeah. This I have to take in Norwegian.
Jo, jeg synes rett og slett at det helt ulogisk at så mye av statsbudsjettet skal gå til å subsidiere folk som har en fast jobb. Fordi hovedproblemet sosialt sett i Norge går ikke mellom de som tjener mye og lite i sin faste jobb, men mellom de som har fast jobb, med de godene det innebærer, og de som ikke har fast jobb. Så for meg det en ren sånn pengeberegning.